The reclassification notices arrived on a Tuesday, printed on the Druath Collective's pale green administrative stock, and Morrow found the first stack of them on the floor outside Processing Hall 7, because someone had slid them under the door during the overnight shift. He picked one up. He read it twice. He set it down on the nearest surface, which happened to be a water pressure manifold he had been calibrating since 6 in the morning, and he stood very still for a moment in the way that people stand still when something they already suspected has just been confirmed in writing. Kai was 25 years old and had spent the last 14 months at Druath Transit Station as an infrastructure technician for the Interstellar Aid Consortium, one of 4 humans on a staff of 31, responsible for water reclamation, atmospheric filtration, and the network of data relay nodes that connected the station's displaced persons registry to the broader interstellar humanitarian database. He was quiet by disposition. He ate lunch alone most days. He had a facility for systems, mechanical, electrical, bureaucratic, that his supervisors described as useful and his colleagues described as unsettling, because he could look at any system and identify, with the patience of someone who was not in any hurry, exactly where its load-bearing points were. The notice in his hand was addressed to a woman named HFY. She was listed in the station's registry as a protected displaced person, Tier 1, pending resettlement review. The notice informed her that, effective the preceding Friday, her status had been reclassified under the Druath Collective's Voluntary Transition Protocol. She was now designated a provisional labor participant. Her resettlement review had been suspended. Her housing allocation would be transferred to collective labor support facilities within 72 hours. There were 411 notices in the stack outside Hall 7. Kai put the notice back on top of the stack. He took out his personal datapad. He opened the station's displaced persons registry. He had access because he maintained the relay nodes, and he pulled HFY's file. Her consent record for the Voluntary Transition Protocol showed a signature and a timestamp. The timestamp was 2:17 in the morning on a Saturday. The signature was a biometric thumb press. He pulled 7 more files at random. All 8 had consent timestamps between midnight and 4 in the morning on either Friday or Saturday. All 8 were thumb press signatures, not retinal or full hand, the lowest tier of biometric confirmation, the one that required the least cooperation from a sleeping or disoriented person. He spent 4 minutes looking at those timestamps. Then he closed the registry, finished calibrating the water pressure manifold, and went to find the station's administrative liaison. The administrative liaison was a Druath Collective official named Peter2nd Venhull, a broad-shouldered figure with the collective's characteristic pale yellow markings along the jaw, who occupied a corner office in the station's administrative annex, and who received Kai with the particular courtesy of someone who did not expect to need to take him seriously. "The Voluntary Transition Protocol," Kai said, setting his datapad on Venhull's desk, "requires documented informed consent under Interstellar Assembly Resolution 47, which defines informed consent as a signature obtained during waking hours following a minimum 6-hour rest period, with a mandatory 48-hour revocation window." Venhull looked at the datapad. "The signatures are valid. The timestamps are between midnight and 4 in the morning. Transition staff work variable hour to accommodate displaced person schedules. All 411 consents in the first batch were obtained within a 72-hour window between 3 different housing blocks by a staff of 6. Kai kept his voice level. "That is 68 consents per staff member over 72 hours, which works out to 1 consent every 63 minutes around the clock for 3 full days, with no record of rest periods for any of the 6 staff members involved." Venhull was quiet for a moment. "These are administrative matters." "They are," Kai agreed. "I am raising them administratively." He left the office and went back to the relay nodes. The station's data infrastructure connected to 7 separate networks: the collective's administrative hub, the Assembly's humanitarian registry, 3 neutral zone transit routing systems, and the Interstellar Aid Consortium's own reporting chain. Kai's access credentials covered all 7, because maintaining the relay nodes required moving data between all 7, and access had never been restricted because no one had thought an infrastructure technician would use it for anything except infrastructure. He spent the rest of that day documenting, not investigating. The facts were not hidden. The Voluntary Transition Protocol had been registered with the Assembly's legal office 14 months ago, exactly 43 days before Kai arrived at Druath Station. Its text was publicly accessible. He read all 37 pages. The protocol was structured around 3 legal pivot points: a provision in the Assembly's Neutral Zone Labor Ordinance that permitted voluntary labor agreements between displaced persons and registered employers, a collective administrative classification that designated all collective labor arrangements as voluntary by definition, and a consent mechanism that required only biometric confirmation without specifying minimum standards for consent conditions. The protocol was not illegal, technically. It was a structure built from 3 separate legitimate provisions, stacked in sequence to produce an outcome that none of the 3 provisions individually permitted. The people who designed it had been patient. They had waited for all 3 provisions to exist simultaneously. Then they had built the stack, registered it quietly, and waited 14 more months for a large enough displaced persons population to make the first application. There were currently 400,209 registered displaced persons at Druath Station. The first batch of 411 was the test. If the test held, the next batch would be 10 times larger. Kai worked until 11 at night. Then he slept for 6 hours and came back. On Wednesday morning, he filed the first report. It went to the consortium's regional director on Hava Station, 2 relay hops away, flagged as procedural concern, low urgency, because high-urgency flags triggered automatic routing to the collective's administrative office for joint review, and Kai had no intention of routing anything through the collective's administrative office. He also submitted that same morning a formal data quality review request to the Assembly's Humanitarian Registry Office, citing anomalous timestamp clustering in the consent records attached to 411 files. A data quality review was a routine administrative function. It triggered a records hold. The reclassifications could not be finalized until the review was complete. That bought 72 hours. He used the first 24 of them to build the map. The Voluntary Transition Protocol's 3 legal pivot points each had an originating office. The Neutral Zone Labor Ordinance provision had been added by amendment 16 months ago, sponsored by a collective trade representative named Agrath Vaughn. The voluntary by definition classification had been registered by the collective's Labor Standards Bureau. The consent mechanism had been approved as part of a package of administrative efficiency measures proposed by the collective's Assembly liaison 18 months ago. All 3 sponsors were on record. All 3 processes had left documentation trails. Kai assembled the trail. He did not characterize it. He did not attach conclusions. He assembled a timeline of 32 events, each one documented with a source reference, showing the sequence in which the 3 provisions had been created, the offices responsible for each, and the gap between each creation date. The timeline ended with the Voluntary Transition Protocol's registration date and the date Druath Station's displaced persons population had crossed 400,000. He sent the timeline without comment to 4 places: the Assembly's Legal Affairs Office, the Consortium's Ethics Board, the Neutral Zone Ombudsman's Office, and the human member of the Assembly's Humanitarian Oversight Committee, a senior diplomat named Anandasai who had been advocating for tighter consent standards in displaced persons agreements for 3 years, and who, as far as Kai could determine, had never seen the three provisions assembled in this particular sequence before. Venhull appeared at Kai's workstation on Thursday morning, just before the 72-hour record's hold was due to expire. "The review window is closing," Venhull said. "The transition process will resume. The Ombudsman's office has requested a 14-day administrative review of the consent protocol," Kai said, without looking up from the relay node he was routing. "That automatically extends the record's hold." Venhull was quiet for a moment. "You filed with the Ombudsman." "The Ombudsman's office is the appropriate venue for neutral zone procedural questions." Kai set down his calibration tool. "I have also flagged the specific timestamp anomalies to the Assembly's Biometric Standards Working Group, which has the authority to issue interim guidance on consent documentation. They are meeting in 4 days." "This is not your concern." Venhull's voice had acquired something beneath the courtesy. "You are an infrastructure technician." "I maintain the relay nodes that connect this station's registry to the Assembly's humanitarian database," Kai said. "Data integrity in that registry is definitionally my concern." He picked up the calibration tool again. "Peter II, I would like to keep having this conversation, but I am on a maintenance window." The Ombudsman's review request extended the record's hold by 14 days. The Biometric Standards Working Group issued interim guidance on day 3 of those 14. Consent documentation for displaced persons must include timestamp verification against the consenting individual's registered sleep cycle data, effective immediately, pending formal rule adoption. The guidance was 2 paragraphs. It applied to every consent record currently under review. 411 consent records failed the new standard. At the same time, the Assembly's Legal Affairs Office contacted Delegate Ananda Sai's office to discuss the timeline Kai had submitted. Sai had already been discussing it with 6 other delegates, as it turned out, 3 of whom served on committees with direct oversight of the Neutral Zone Labor Ordinance. The amendment that Agrath Vaughn had sponsored 16 months ago was referred to the Ordinance Review Panel for assessment. The voluntary by definition classification was suspended pending that assessment. The protocol's first and third legal pivot points remained intact. The second one was collapsing. On day 9 of the 14-day hold, Kai received a visit from a collective administrator he had not met before, more senior than Venhull, with the deeper yellow jaw markings of a senior grade. She did not introduce herself by name. She sat down across from him in the consortium's small break room and said, quietly, that the collective was prepared to release the 411 individuals from their transition agreements if the outstanding review processes were withdrawn. "I did not file the review processes," Kai said. "The Ombudsman filed a review. The Biometric Standards Working Group issued interim guidance. The Ordinance Review Panel is conducting an assessment. Those are independent bodies. You initiated them. I submitted factual documentation to the appropriate offices. What they did with it is their process." He looked at her steadily. "The 411 can be released from their transition agreements right now, under the revocation window that has always been available to them. That does not require anything to be withdrawn." She left without saying anything else. The 411 were released on day 11. Each received a notice that their transition agreement had been canceled due to administrative irregularities. Their protected status was restored. Their resettlement reviews were reinstated. The Voluntary Transition Protocol remained technically registered. The assessment panel was still working. The ordinance review was still running. Kai spent day 12 on a diagnostic of the station's atmospheric filtration array, which had shown a pressure variance for 2 weeks. He found a worn seal in the secondary return loop, replaced it, and logged the repair. On day 14, the Ordnance Review Panel issued its findings. The amendment Agrath Vaughn had sponsored contained a drafting anomaly that created an unintended interaction with the neutral zone voluntary labor provision. The amendment was suspended for redrafting. With that pivot point suspended, and the consent records failing biometric review, the protocol had no remaining legal surface to stand on. It was not struck down. It was not declared illegal. It simply had no ground left under it. The Assembly's Humanitarian Oversight Committee opened a formal inquiry into the collective's administrative conduct at Druath Station 3 days later. The inquiry was not Kai's doing. That had come from Sai's office, from the 6 delegates, from the Legal Affairs Review. The inquiry requested that the collective provide full documentation of all transition processes undertaken at any neutral zone station in the past 4 years. There were 9 other stations. The collective's neutral zone processing license was suspended pending the inquiry's outcome. 17 days after that, with the documentation request unanswered and the inquiry expanding to cover all 9 sites, the collective formally withdrew its administrative presence from Druath Station. Kai heard about the withdrawal from a colleague named Pritha, who had been at the station 2 years longer than he had, and who came to find him in the relay node maintenance corridor on a Friday afternoon to tell him, because she thought he would want to know. "They are gone," she said. "All collective administrative staff. The license suspension converted to a permanent revocation this morning." Kai finished tightening the connection he was working on. "Good," he said. 400,000 people, Pritha said. "You know that, right? That is how many were going to be next." He did know. He had known since the first morning, when he had done the math on the batch size and the timeline, and understood what came after the test. He had not thought about it in those terms since, because thinking about it in those terms was not useful. What was useful was the data quality review request, and the timeline and the biometric standards working group and the ordnance review panel, and all the other levers that existed for situations like this one. Levers that worked if someone used them correctly, in sequence, without stopping. "The filtration array was running a pressure variance," he told Pritha. "I found the seal. It is fixed now." She looked at him for a moment. "You are talking about the filtration array." "I'm also talking about the other thing." He picked up his kit. Same answer. He had a second relay node to check before end of shift. The node connected the station's humanitarian registry to the Assembly database, the link that made the displaced person's records visible, that made them countable, that made them real in the system that governed what happened to them. He ran the diagnostic, confirmed the link was clean, and logged it. 400,209 people, whose names and case files lived in that registry, had never known any of it was in danger. They had not known about the protocol, or the test batch, or the 14-month setup, or the 72-hour reclassification window. Most of them would never know. Their files simply continued to exist, protected and processing, connected to the network that held them. Kai walked back down the corridor to the tool room, returned his kit, and signed out for the day. Outside, through the station's upper viewport, the stars were the same as they always were, indifferent and permanent and very far away. Somewhere in the humanitarian registry, 400,000 case files waited for their reviews. The collective's legal architecture was gone. The ground it had needed no longer existed. The people it had meant to take were still here, still protected, still counted by a network that had not broken because someone had made sure it did not. He went home. He had an early start in the morning.